Are we live, Josh?
Yes, we are live, sir.
Oh, very good. Well, thank you everyone for joining and we looks like we have most of the water committee here. Now maybe we have everyone. Um, Welcome to the Department of Food and Ag Water Committee meeting. Um, I was just thinking, Josh, we have some formalities to cover to begin with. A roll, would you take a roll and then we'll have the flag salute
Perfect, yes, sir. Bryce Lumber,
here.
Mike Gallo,
Here.
Linda Humiston. Here. David Shabazian,
Here.
Don Cameron,
Here.
we have four.
Thank you. And I think then we'll just have the Pledge of Allegiance before we get started. Let's thank you, Josh, for preparing for that. We'll go salute pledge. I pledge allegiance
To
to
the flag
of the
of
United
the
States
United
of
States
America
of America
and to the
and to the
republic
republic
for which it
for which
stands,
it stands,
one
one
nation,
nation,
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with
with
liberty
liberty and justice for all.
Well, I was wondering if we would want to start, Secretary Ross, if you had any report you would like to start with, or just get right into the meeting.
No, thank you, Bryce. The one thing I'll mention is that our animal health division is deep in the surveillance and response to the H5N1 in dairy cattle. Our surveillance regions are fairly large and bring in a large number of dairy herds. The numbers, as we do more testing, are increasing. That's not unexpected. We have commissioned additional resources from USDA, APHIS, and have great cooperation with them as well as with our partners at the Department of Public Health. Last week, Under Secretary Jenny Lester Moffitt from USDA hosted a tour of a dairy in our lab facilities. Last Wednesday, we had staff member from the White House who is a part of the pandemic prevention and response task force, someone who's been assigned to that from CDC, who was part of the tour along with USDA officials, the Department of Public Health, Joe Shea from the governor's office, and Undersecretary Birdsong were able to be a part of that tour that really provided a good overview of the biosecurity measures that are taken on dairy farms, and in particular of our laboratories. And I think it was a very informative trip, and I think it will enhance the understanding of the scale of our dairy sector and all the precautionary measures that are in place. So I did want to bring you up to date on that because it's an ongoing issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, a very significant. It's not one thing, it's another, isn't it, Secretary Ross?
Always multiple things.
Well, it is the 10-year anniversary for a couple of significant measures or issues in the state of California. It's the 10-year anniversary of Prop 1, funding for infrastructure for water and for many things in California. We still are looking forward to Prop 1 funding coming out for the Sites Reservoir and other projects. It is the 10-year anniversary of SGMA. Hard to believe that 2014 was the signing there with Governor Brown and many key water leaders for the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. And there's been a lot of progress. There's been a lot of effort. And today, we'd like to just have an update from those who are working on this issue to give us their perspective. You know, just a very hands-on perspective that I guess I'd like to share. Don Cameron and I were up hiking in the Sierra. Was that just that was like maybe the end of August, wasn't it, Don? We were hiking up there in the Sierra in the woods, and we came out into this opening and this nice little meadow. And Don and I kind of noticed there was a hole in the ground out there in the middle of that meadow. And I think I'm getting the story right, aren't I, Don? There was a big old hole out there in the middle of that meadow, and we went up and looked at that hole, and Don said, well, that looks like a deep hole. I said, yep, that looks like a deep hole. And Don grabbed a rock and threw it in, and we listened, and it never hit the bottom, never hit water or anything, right? And I was still figuring with Sigma and everything that there would be a nice water table there that would hit. And I grabbed a bigger rock and threw it in, and it never hit the bottom. Well, Don and I saw that there was a railroad tie nearby, and we just grabbed that thing and threw it down that hole. And we listened, and out from the trees came a goat. It was a big goat, and it was flying at us. It took like 1 or 2 bounces, and it flew down that hole. It was weird, wasn't it, Don? It was one of the weirdest things.
Pretty amazing, Bryce.
Yep. And pretty soon a guy came out of the woods and talked to us and said, hey, I'm missing a goat. You haven't seen my goat. And we told him about a goat that flew down the hole. And he said, well, that wasn't my goat. My goat's tied to a railroad tie. And so we got out of there, didn't we, Don? But
It was close.
yeah, what that story reminded me of is that first that hole didn't have water in the bottom of it, and under Sigma, I would expect that there would be some water there. But people see things from different perspectives. Our perspective was we knew what this story was, and the goat owner there didn't, and it takes different perspectives, I think, to get the full picture. And today we'd like to get different perspectives to get the whole picture. So I think we've had a state of California, we've had a good focus on aquifer recharge under Sigma. We know that in order to have fewer impacts on agriculture and on communities, we need to have significant and effective aquifer recharge. I think I'm very aware that everyone in the agencies, from the agencies to the governor's office, is very aware of the need to make take every opportunity for aquifer recharge, taking every opportunity to make the most of it. And so today I look forward to hearing from these experts on how that's going, on what's working, what's going good, what might not be going as well as we would hope, and how we could make things better. Hoping for at the end of the meeting, if there would be some next steps that the committee or the panelists would recommend. We will start, and I'm thankful to have Charles Delgado from Sustainable Conservation here to present all the great work that you're doing at Sustainable Conservation. We have all been very familiar with Ashley Bourne and her work here with us on the State Board of Food and Ag. And Charles, if you would share with us just a bit of your background and then make your presentation, that would be great.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the introduction, Bryce, and for the invite to speak here today to this group. So I know most folks in this room are pretty familiar with sustainable conservation, so I'll save you the elevator pitch, just for our organization. But we do, of course, have a long track record of working in the space of recharge and Sigma implementation. Like Bryce said, having recharge is an essential component of how we get to sustainability and making sure that we have that water available, for all uses. So my personal background, so I am the policy director here at Sustainable Conservation. So you've a lot of our other folks, are out in the field, they're doing the projects. I'm the guy that is in Sacramento working with the agencies and the legislature to kind of help really pave the way for incentivizing and enabling these recharge projects that are going to be necessary to help get us to a successful implementation of Sigma. My personal background, I spent 13 years at the State Water Board in their Legislative Affairs Office. So I was around for the creation of Sigma, which was something that, of course, as folks know, was years in the making. It was a very, complex path that got us to, the initial bills that made up Sigma. It's been a complex path as we've, learned as we've gone, creating, new tools all the time, to, meet these challenges that have been set before us. So So I worked, in not like all different areas when I was at the board. Sigma was one, drinking water, that coming over to the board from Department of Public Health. But I spent 8 of those years as the assistant director of that unit. So my background is very legislative, and I joined Sustainable Conservation in 2021. And since then, I've really done, I've tried to support our work with our Water for the Future team, and their work in setting up things like the groundwater rapid assessment tool, and the watershed studies in the valley that are going to be coming out soon. And then just some examples of where we've been active in the policy space. We sponsored SB 1390 this prior year. That was intended to follow up on the authority to divert flood flows for groundwater recharge without the necessity of a water rights permit. That was something that was established first by the governor's office and their executive orders in the 2023 kind of wet year. And then its codification that same year in SB 122 in the Natural Resources Trailer Bill. So a lot of the folks in this room today, and we're not going to spend, at least my presentation isn't necessarily going to cover the SB 122 process, but folks here will have been familiar, I think, with some of the need for follow-up. So we really were trying to attempt to clarify the conditions under which that authority could be exercised, and then who's able to avail themselves of that authority, because there's a couple of areas of ambiguity that, and really it's just us trying to really make it an accessible process for recharge practitioners. And that's a theme that's going to come up in my presentation here shortly. But I'll just reiterate again, folks know us, but I really do think it's worth pointing out that, we pride ourselves on a collaborative approach to solving these problems and to meeting these challenges. Sigma is not always a collaborative process, of course, but we really do believe in involving all stakeholders. So we pride ourselves in our relationships with the agricultural community, with environmentalists, with community groups, to just really, find those solutions that everyone can get behind. And I think recharge is a solution that ultimately everyone can get behind. So with that, I think I'll go into my presentation. I'm going to go ahead and attempt to share my screen. Okay. And are folks seeing a PowerPoint? Fantastic. So I'll go ahead and start that slideshow. Great. So I'll just, as a quick intro, I'm going to try and keep it fairly high level. Water rights, and just to kind of, water rights is a complicated process. I don't need to tell anyone that, but I'm going to really tee us up for a conversation, because I know there are other speakers in this room that are pursuing recharge projects. Those are the ones with the real world experience in doing these projects, and their insights are really what led us to our knowledge as we kind of continue to move forward on this water rights process, and continue to collect input to make sure that we're really traveling in the right direction here. So I'll go ahead and move that forward. So I'm just going to start with just kind of a background, for what do we have, what are the available pathways for obtaining surface water rights for recharge projects. So I talked earlier about the process that was laid out in 2023 for diverting without a water right. So that's one particular pathway. I view it as sort of a two-pronged approach when it comes to recharge. It's important to have diversion of flood flows outside of the water rights system, just to kind of enable that flexibility and that ability to capture flows, in real time as we're mitigating, protection or public safety concerns, protecting private property, and getting that water into a space where then the GSAs can determine how best to use those supplies and ultimately what happens. But to me also, the longer kind of bigger scale solutions are going to require a backing of surface water rights, because then what we have, we're able to plan projects that ultimately lead to, specified uses. And so we're really, putting that water to work and making sure that, when folks invest, these are not these larger projects. These are fairly big scale, undertakings involving, infrastructure of different kinds, significant investments. And in order to enable investments in a kind of stable environment, we need to have the supporting water rights. So prior to 2016, your pathway, and continues to be so, but your pathway was the traditional appropriative water rights process. Without going into too deep, because I can and I have spent a few hours kind of going over that process, but just very, very briefly, this is for someone that doesn't already hold a surface water right or does not have access under a contract to surface water. You'll need to apply to the State Water Board to establish basically the right to divert flows under certain conditions at certain points of diversion for a specified use. So I say it's the standard method of acquiring a new water right. There's, of course, other pathways to water rights outside of the filing for an appropriative right, those with existing rights. Those can be pre-1914 rights associated with parcels, which water rights that predate the modern system. Riparian rights, employability rights. There's a number of different areas where that can happen, but we'll be focusing kind of on this environment in which folks will need to apply for a new right. So this in some ways is sort of the gold standard in the sense that what this does is set up a permanent right to divert water for, in this case, your recharge project. So obviously that's preferable to something that's got a limited time period where you'll have to go back, and file again. So if you can get it, it's a very solid foundation compared to others upon which, to design projects around and to really kind of enable water managers to plan for the long term and to kind of get that water onto the supply side of the ledger. These rights, of course, must be tied to a beneficial use. This will come up a little bit later when we talk about potential barriers. But State of California has a roster of listed beneficial uses, which are sanctioned for how we use water. There is a number of beneficial uses that are related, but not necessarily directly tied to SGMA. We'll get to that in a little bit. One thing of really big note is that groundwater storage is not in and of itself considered a beneficial use. So one cannot file a water right application for just recharging water without either basically ultimately, an identified way to extract that water for use, or if it's tied to, ways of basically preventing certain, not specifically undesirable results, but protecting your aquifer. We'll go into that in a little bit. So that does factor into some potential issues. Those that have interacted with this process know that it is a very lengthy, expensive, and complex process. And there is absolutely no guarantee of success when you file for an appropriative water right. You have to first, there's filing the application and associated analyses that go with that is a very time-consuming and intensive process, one of which is a water availability analysis. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But there's also there's CEQA, and then there is a public protest process, and that particular part has been known to drag water rights applications out for decades. I think that there's a couple that are still going that I think maybe have hit the 50-year mark. I mean, it gets very complicated. It's a very legalistic process, which makes it really, in a lot of cases, for a smaller district or someone that's not a disadvantaged community, or someone that doesn't have those kinds of resources, it kind of puts this process out of reach for a lot of folks. So that is the default in some ways, but that was pretty much your option prior to 2016 until the Water Board develops new tools. So in order to kind of address this policy need for recharge projects and to better enable bolstering water supplies this way, the State Water Board created temporary water rights permits in 2016. So there are two different kinds of permits. There is the 180-day permit, and then there's the 5-year permit. So, and I'm going to take this moment just to sort of kind of set the tone a little bit, because the fact that the Water Board was involved and active in establishing these permits, which have some issues, which we'll talk about, but it reflects an understanding on the state water board side that, that recharge isn't necessary and that it needs state incentives and processes to enable that outside of this kind of cumbersome appropriative water right process. So they understand, and I see them as allies in this conversation. So, we're going to talk about barriers in this process, but I view it as a collaborative process, and I view the water board as partners and kind of helping to refine, these existing tools. So just wanted to kind of, because as we get in these conversations, sometimes the temperature gets a little high. I like to keep things collegial and, keep us all on the same page. So just wanted to say that. And the creation of these, was intended to be a more accessible and less complex process compared to the appropriative right. Ultimately with the aim of establishing these, in a much, much quicker, time period and finalizing these and enabling these short-term, 180 days, that's a blink of an eye in the water conversation. So, and fundamentally, really temporary is the key word here. It establishes a right to divert water over a limited time period. So this is not a permanent right. The water board's stated process is that they view these as a bridge, that basically it's sort of a proof of concept that, you have a project, you get this right associated with it, and it demonstrates success in support of an eventual appropriative water right or a permanent water right in the end. Whether it actually does that or not, and whether that's really, ultimately the most appropriate use of these permits, I expect some of our other speakers today are going to have something to say about that. But that's sort of, how it's viewed at the agency level. So the intention is that these work this way. In practice, this has not really worked this way, and there's a number of reasons for that. Key thing to remember is that, because this question comes up sometimes, the temporary permits are not as intensive in terms of the application materials and the process. They are still not, they're significant, and they still do require the identification of a beneficial use. I think I've heard some misconceptions around that, but that is still a key component, and that still brings the same complications that one might encounter when they're filing for an appropriative right. So another kind of pathway, in addition to these that I've just described, are a streamlined appropriative right. So this does establish, like the traditional appropriative right, a permanent ability to divert water under specifications. So it's more complex and more time consuming than a temporary right. But ideally, again, as envisioned by the board, it is less of a burdensome process than the traditional appropriative water rights system. It's really, this right is designed specifically for water agencies and managers and GSAs with an eye towards recharge projects to get to SGMA compliance. So that's the key audience, and that's who it's supposed to be for. There are some boundaries around the kinds of projects that this is intended to cover. So basically, the threshold is that it's unlikely to injure other legal users of water, unlikely to affect fisheries or the environment or other public trust resources, and that it's limited to peak flows during winter months. That's another key distinction that we'll talk about when it comes time to look at the barriers. But it's sort of a limiting of the universe of potential applicants, which ideally is in service to allowing the board to really prioritize and move these applications along quicker. So in exchange for kind of going along with these limitations at the outset, the board tries to prioritize these applications above others, depending on what their current staff workload is and where their priorities are, and that by the very nature of complying with those limitations, they anticipate that this passes through CEQA on a more quickly and cleanly. But really, there's no real inherent kind of it's not a CEQA exemption. There isn't a different set of rules, but it's just in terms of managing existing resources at the board is how they try to achieve this streamlining process. Once again, beneficial use is still a necessary component of this right. And I mentioned that so the overlap with avoiding sigma undesirable results. So as I mentioned before, in the listing of beneficial uses of water, sigma compliance itself is not in and of itself a beneficial use, but things like avoiding seawater intrusion, so managing salinity, or protecting the water quality of your aquifer, which is becoming more and more important with the advent of regulatory programs like CV salts in the Central Valley. Those are beneficial uses, which in a lot of cases will enable recharge. But in other cases, that may still be a factor because, again, there's not an inherent beneficial use for storage of water. So that's sort of the landscape we find ourselves with at present. Those are the pathways for establishing surface water rights in support of a recharge project. So these bullet points here are the result of a process that I'll talk about briefly before I get into this. But back in 2022, Sustainable Conservation convened an ad hoc kind of flood managed aquifer recharge water rights working group because we had been hearing through our partners that there was a lot of exciting projects and a lot of recharge of available water that folks were trying to do. But when it came time to get the water rights for those projects, there was just folks were encountering a lot of hurdles. Some they can navigate, some are insurmountable, and it proved to really be an impediment to the scale of recharge that we need to be seeing if we're going to get to sustainability. So we talked with a number of water managers, districts, and GSAs. We also we coordinated this kind of process with the Department of Water Resources. So we kind of were relying on agency expertise as well outside of the Water Board. And it was just a series of conversations where, we tried to really dive into, what are the key points where, people are encountering barriers to obtaining water rights so that we're identifying the problem, correctly, and we're knowing really where to focus our efforts. And so with that input, the first thing is that the lack of an adequate trigger that because they talked earlier about some of these rights are designed around we're doing this at peak flow, we're seeing precipitation events and we're diverting water when there's water in the system that's sufficient to be able to do this. The problem with that is that there isn't a widely regarded implementable clear threshold where the state can say, okay, there's enough water in the system for the environment, for communities, for agriculture and other users, where we can kind of give the green light to do this. We do have some existing methods to do it, but none of them are perfect. The most frequently cited in my experience is the 90-20 rule. And that is something that's baked into certain water rights, but it's really not. It's kind of a one size fits all, approach to determining when sufficient flows are present. It doesn't take into account localized conditions where in certain cases more water might be available, less water might be available, and it's not really something that applies to everywhere all the time. So we believe that that there isn't, that there might not be necessarily one cookie cutter approach, but we really do need to refine our understanding of how we determine, when we have available flows. One of the other issues is that it's the timing. These permits right now are applicable from December 1st to March 31st, which quite frankly is really an outdated view of when we're seeing high flow precipitation events. 2023 really taught us that these storms don't obey previous weather patterns. They aren't neatly limited to these regulatory windows. They happen frequently in different times a year. It's a little bit much less predictable. And so really, if we're to have the flexibility to capture flows when they're available, we really can't limit ourselves to this kind of a window. And we, in our experience, in our work, the majority of high flow events happen outside of this window after March 31st. So that's become a hard limit in these permits, and it's something that needs to be addressed. A frequent component of these permits is the water availability analysis. So this is something that we've heard specifically cited as one of the most difficult parts of a water rights application. It's something that requires, in most cases, outside expertise. It takes a long time. It's very expensive. So that in itself is a deterrent. But we also believe that the approach is not necessarily the correct one from a policy perspective. Relying on permit applicants to kind of put together a piecemeal picture of where water is available in the state's streams and rivers. It's work that really in a perfect world, really ought to be coordinated at the agency level, in cooperation, with the regulated community. But it's something to where, it would be helpful to have a single point of reference and a consistent set of guidance as to how these analyses are done, and ideally taking the burden of establishing that background information off of an applicant. And that alone would save, a ton of effort. Not that I'll as I close out on this slide, and I'll put some caveats on that. And then lastly, at this point, the fees have definitely become an issue. So I know I've heard from some folks, this was just last week, the board adopted its emergency regs establishing water rights fees. The increases this year for the permits it's pretty eye-watering. When I say that's not a typo, for the larger projects, these fees have increased in some cases by 1,800%, which is, again, I am not here to, the water board is not a piñata in this discussion. I'm not here to, take the bat to them. But it is, it's you can't ignore that precipitous of a climb when it comes to the fees. And that is going to prove to be a very substantial barrier to obtaining the rights to make these projects happen. I'm sure that other folks after me are going to mention something about that. But at this point, this is definitely like what we've heard the most in our interactions on this process. By identifying these, you can tell that we have some kind of notions as to where we think that the solutions may lay. But I'm still pretty focused on just this sort of collective learning process before we really begin to engage with the board. I don't have a preset base of solutions that we are 100% committed to. We're continuing to learn more. We're continuing to build our partners in this conversation. And that's also intended to really allow for other voices and to really kind of, again, learn from the experience of the folks that are doing these projects. So in identifying these, I'm not necessarily, trying to limit the conversation, but to me, that's a starting point. And we'll hear a lot more from other folks as we go. So in terms of next steps, I mentioned earlier that Sustainable Conservation had convened a water rights working group back in 2022. So this is not to say that we're done with the SB 122 process outside of the water rights system. But we've kind of gotten a little bit more bandwidth now that, now that that's been codified, we're going to continue to work to follow that up. But we're really kind of turning our focus back to the water rights system. So we are reactivating that working group. And that's actually something that's happening very, very soon. And we're hoping to get some real results by the end of this year. We've chosen as a forum for enabling this, because previously this was just sort of, again, an ad hoc group that we'd convened on our own. Sustainable Conservation and a lot of folks here today are part of a process called the San Joaquin Valley Collaborative Action Plan. This is a group that was initially convened several years ago by Tim Quinn of just basically everyone in the water conversation in the Valley with an idea of really kind of establishing where everyone can work together, where we can all come together around solutions to the problems facing the Valley, and then using the power of that coalition to really seek, beneficial change and to, make a real difference. So this is one small piece of that process. As part of that, we've convened we have a groundwater recharge subgroup that has begun to serve as kind of an incubator for ideas as to, how can we best enable recharge. So we're going to be using that as the starting point of convening this group. It is not the exclusive venue. We're going to be reaching out, we're not only reaching out, but also, open to anyone that really wants to be a part of this process. So the intention of the working group is to continue refining our understanding of where the choke points and where the barriers are in the water rights process. And part of that is we're going to be expanding the scope of the group. We were very focused on water agencies and managers, but we really want to solicit more direct participation from conservationists, from EJ, but also from, we want more ag voices, both in this conversation and the larger San Joaquin Valley Collaborative Action Plan process as well. And the idea behind that will be to just continue building out our understanding of the problem, starting to come around what the solutions may look like, and what specific recommendations that we can draw up for the administration. This is not to say that there's one pathway or that that all solutions will be implementable in the same time period. But we have really tried to focus our efforts on what can be done with existing state authority right now, because this is a problem right now. It's something that we want to solve as soon as possible. There is a larger conversation. There may ultimately be a need for statutory change. And if that's what's necessary, we're certainly happy to work on that. But in the short term, we really want to have just a set of actionable recommendations that the State Water Board and the governor's office can take. And as part of that process, we're going to try to work with the State Water Board as much as possible. Again, we want this to be a collaborative process. We want all to be pulling in the same direction. And in that spirit, I've mentioned, there are these issues with the process. We do believe that the State Water Board is aware that more work needs to be done. They have done some outreach around the temporary permits. They had a workshop over the summer on the temporary permits. And that's part of some initial feedback that we have had as part of this, is that in some cases, it's just these are complicated processes. These permits are not easy. And even among, sophisticated and experienced water managers, people that have been doing this a long time, the process is not clear. There are points of ambiguity, and it can be really daunting. And so part of this is also just closing the information gap. And we had talked with the water board about doing more outreach and, kind of educating folks and being available to kind of help work with folks to provide technical assistance. So we're starting to see them do that. So we know that they're taking action. And that they're taking the problem seriously. And we expect that they'll continue to do so. But there's probably ways for us to kind of guide them and to kind of identify where the most efficient places are to do that kind of outreach, and where education and where assistance is most needed. But ultimately, I am really excited, and I really do think that we have the urgency, we have the willingness among folks in the SGMA kind of regulated community. And we have an agency that I think will be receptive. So that's where we stand currently. And I'll go ahead and stop sharing and kind of let the Q&A process happen.
Thank you, Charles. That was a great overview, and really appreciate the background and really appreciate the work of sustainable conservation in keeping this going. Open up to Q&A.
So Glenda has her hand up, Bryce.
Oh, very good. Thanks, Glenda.
Thanks, Bryce. I guess I know a lot of our UC researchers are working closely with sustainable conservation on many aspects of this. And you brought up several times pinch points or ambiguity or lack of information. Do we have a clear path of what research is needed to get some of those answers to make this process work better? Or is that something we need to develop?
So I think the answer is yes to both. I think that, but I can tell you that where research is needed and where more information and data is needed is really tied to that flow question. And that is also one of the main sources of ambiguity. We just don't have, 90-20 again, it's sort of a, not to, I don't mean to sound flip about it, but, it's kind of a back of the envelope calculation, 90th percentile, limiting it to 20, percent. I mean, again, that will work in some cases, but we really need to understand, and this is where we get into efforts. I know that there have been some efforts to do this. Sorry, I'll butcher the acronym, but with CEF, the California Environmental Flows Framework. Sorry. I know that's a start to that, where they're really monitoring sort of what the needs of the watershed are and what the available water is at any over time, because different times of year, of course, there's different impacts. And then also what the future is going to look like, because my understanding is that model starts to take into account climate change and, what the trends are and what things might be looking like, in 10, 20 years down the line. Our anticipation, and this is not, by the way, an explicit endorsement necessarily of that process, because we're still learning. And I know that there may be, there's maybe other methods of getting at that. But in some places, I expect that it'll result in more available water than 90-20, and in some places it'll be less. But it'll be at least a basis in just understanding it. And this is not even to say, in some places we don't even know what the quantity to start with is in the system. We don't have stream gauges all over the place. That's something that our organization, we are consistently in support of the state providing funding to expand that network. So that's, part of the budgets, part of the bond bills, and we haven't talked about Prop 4, but that's it. But that's the kind of, in my experience, where the scientific community could really, really help contribute to kind of furthering understanding and refining that process.
Secretary Ross has a question, Bryce.
Hi.
Thank you.
A couple of questions. At one time, Sustainable Conservation, did an initial watershed study to try to determine what is the available water analysis. And then for a brief moment of time, it looked like we were going to get more of those studies funded. And I think a lot of that has disappeared. So what is the state of that kind? I mean, that might not be micro enough for each individual GSA or entity, but what is the state of doing those kinds of comprehensive watershed analysis for trying to identify available water? Because perhaps the university systems could do that. That's question number one. Question number two is, I don't recall, was there a timeline for the CAP facilitated process to have a set of recommendations for the administration?
So to answer the first question, so you're correct that, we had the initial watershed study in the Merced watershed, which, is sort of a pilot, so to speak, for the rest of the valley. My understanding is that we have 4 more watersheds, which our studies will be coming out for. And don't hold me to account for the exact date; those are going to get released. But I believe that's happening soon. That itself is a really good conversation that I'd love to invite folks. And so I'm happy to connect you with our director of water, Rochelle Young, who's overseeing that process. And my understanding is that those studies will be completed in the near future. But there's going to be a lot, and where the money has become kind of a difference maker is in the implementation of those studies. And there's a lot of technical assistance that we hope will come with that, that we're hoping to enable. This is one of our hopes for the bond, of course, because as everyone knows, we've had a pretty challenging budget environment, and we're going to have that again. So we're looking to say, hopefully that measure will help to enable more of this work. But we will, be continuing regardless. So, if anyone ever wants to get deeper into that, I'm happy to set up a conversation. I would love for folks to connect and learn more about that. And then, and I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question, Karen?
The CAP facilitated process.
Thank you. Yeah.
Perhaps recommendations to the administration.
So I know that, so the current facilitator for CAP is Jim Kramer, and I know that he really, really wants to have some actionable items by the end of the year. So we always like to have something to show, for all of our work. We focused a lot over the last few months on this process S2J2, and forgive me because the acronym escapes me. I think some folks here have actually been part of that. But it's a process convened by Ashley Swearingen to kind of produce a very sophisticated investment strategy for the valley. And as part of that, water infrastructure was a big portion. So we kind of focused our group's efforts on that. And we're still working on that. That's still an in progress thing. But it has sort of, it's resulted in a jumbling of priorities a little bit. But nonetheless, we do hope to have by the end of this year, at the very least, a set of actionable recommendations, if not necessarily the advocacy with the agencies that will follow that up.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Other questions? Charles, you mentioned that, there's this kind of two pathways, and if I've got it right, there's a water right pathway, and then there's the permit pathway. And then the permit, there's the 180-day and a 5-year. Where do you think we get the most bang for the buck? Where do we get you think the most for encouraging water districts or GSAs to engage? Would you say it's both, or would you say there's an area there where you get more bang for the buck?
That's a very good question, Bryce. And I think that and I see Don's got his hand up, so I don't want to take too much time here. And I'm really interested in his input and others on that very question. From my experience, I think in the long run, fixing the water rights system, ultimately, it's a more predictable, insofar as we have predictability, which we honestly don't. Yep. But that I think really builds up the larger scale projects that I would hope to see. Those have designated uses. So I think that maybe is a more structurally impactful of the two pathways. Now that said, I think that the SB 122 process outside of the water rights system, that to me is one where it's a no-brainer. I think that's the one where here's available water that we're diverting anyway for flood safety. Why are we not utilizing these flows when we can be? And I think that the drawback to that is that because there's no beneficial use tied to it, that's not a bad thing in some cases. But it means that if someone pursues a recharge project, they don't, and this will be really relevant to, Don's experience, but if I'm putting water on my land, it doesn't enable me to, pump out, any more than I did before. There's no direct benefit, and as it stands in a lot of places, to doing that recharge. So the water rights system kind of comes with that benefit baked in. But the SB 122 process requires a few steps after that. And so I guess, and I know I'm discoursing a little bit from your initial question, Bryce, but I think in GSAs where proper incentive structures have been adopted for pursuing recharge, that may actually be more impactful for growers and for people in the GSAs if they have a system where they can take excess water and participate in the recharge, and they see benefit from it. That's really going to move the needle, I think, for a lot of folks. And so a lot of people, I think, have seen the PPIC study that came out a couple months back about, what the potential availability of water to be recharged is. I mean, it's a huge amount. And so, any way we can pursue that, that's going to be helpful. So I think both are definitely worth pursuing and worth putting our effort into. And so, but and I really do. I'm interested to hear about, what people that are doing these projects, what they think about that.
Thank you, Charles. Don.
Hey, Bryce. Yep, Charles, I really appreciate your presentation. Really covered everything. Your pinch points, I think, are spot on. I mean, you highlighted the real issues that we're facing and trying to move floodwater off flooded waterways and getting it back into the ground. We really appreciated the governor's executive order in 2023 that really opened the door and it really showed how much water on short notice could get put back in the ground. It was over 400,000 acre feet. But you're right, it is very time consuming and expensive to go down the 5-year permit process. And I think you're right, the State Water Board does look at that as a transition to a permanent right down the road, which is good. But you know, we've got 16 years remaining till 2040, which is when we need to be sustainable for SGMA. And, you know, on average, we see a flood every 4 years. So that's 4 opportunities in the next 16 years. And, you know, I just hate to see us have another wet year and miss out again on being able to bring this floodwater onto land and get it into ground. But you're right. It would be great if we had some type of ownership to the water that we developed to, you know, facilities to bring on farm. We know long term it's going to be beneficial, but still it'd be nice to have our name on it. And we look at it, the GSA, as possibly being able to do some type of credit program within the GSA to maybe alleviate that. So anyway, I just want to thank you for the really good presentation and really getting all the issues up to the surface. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. And I think you just made a really, really important point that not to get too deep into advocacy for our bill, but you know, when we introduced SB 1390, you know, they told us, you know, like, why are you guys, you know, why are you doing this now? You know, what's the urgency? Because there's a lot of folks in the Capitol that view, you know, the SB 122 authority as something that they're just going to kind of sit back and let it play out, and they're going to learn. And, you know, and this is fine. This is how, you know, programs are designed in most other spaces, is that you do something for 5 years, you learn the lessons, and then you determine if you want to keep doing it. And, you know, but until then you let it work. But in this case, we really do have that sense of urgency. You're exactly right, Don. We're going to have maybe there's a limited number of chances left before 2040 to get this right. And our thinking, you know, and our advocacy was that, you know, this is something we need to get this working the way that it should as soon as possible. 2040 might seem like a long way off, but we're not going to have many more opportunities to do this. So I really appreciate you highlighting that and bringing up that point.
David?
So, pardon my ignorance on this if this is a dumb question, but I'm really intrigued by the larger watershed studies as a setting for understanding supply and demand, supply in particular. Question number 1 is kind of how far up the watershed did the Merced study go, or what would you recommend? Question 2 is, are you looking at the land use component of this? So, I mean, you know, I think that recharge is a land use. It's a land use. I mean, in some respects, especially where you don't have any viable agriculture anymore. So it's a land use that requires, you know, some sort of a right to do that, much like you would need a right to develop, you know, an industrial park or a housing development. So I'm curious how it nests in the larger question about how we're using our land for outcomes that are driving on things that we need, you know, kind of writ large across the state.
So I can tell you immediately that those are definitely not dumb questions, David, because on the first one, I actually will need to get back to you on how far up that goes. So that's something that I'll circle back around, because I'm unsure of what the specific extent is. I can say that when it comes to land use, I do believe that that's not really an integrated part of these yet, because I mean, land use is a larger issue, of course, and we've talked about in, you know, other venues, you know, through the context of land repurposing programs. So I don't believe that there is much specific guidance in that way, but that's another one I'll double check with Rochelle on and see, because I know that there's follow-up work coming to these studies, and we have talked a lot about how that factors into it, but it's an emerging kind of policy space for sure. So I'll go ahead.
Yeah, I'm really interested in circling back with you to talk about these studies. I mean, this is something that we experience in the multi-benefit land repurposing program, is kind of tension between different uses in different areas and what people's preferences are. And it also came up in S2J2, which is, this tension between, are we going to use the land for energy production? Are we going to use it for agriculture? Are we going to use it for recharge? Are we going to use it for rewilding? And I think that those kind of bigger rocks that we need to move are really important in figuring out kind of ideal solutions. And then you got to put the rights to all of those different uses.
Absolutely.
Lee.
Yeah, Charles, maybe I could take a stab because we've been involved with sustainable conservation on the technical work on all of those watershed studies that Charles was mentioning. And so in terms of your question of how far up the watershed it goes to the boundaries of the watershed, right? And these are primarily focused in the Merced and San Joaquin River watersheds. We know those watersheds are primarily snow and snowmelt runoff driven, and a key component of those studies is to understand how climate change may affect this availability of water for recharge. So the geographical extent is all the way up to the Sierra Nevada in the mountains, and then all the way downstream to the aquifers and the lands along the river. And then in regards to your question on land use, I'm not sure that I can fully answer that, but I can tell you that the assumptions that are built into that analysis are that we would be able to do recharge on active agricultural areas and existing recharge facilities in the area. We're assuming that the land essentially stays in the production that it has been under based on the historical land use, but sustainable conservation plays a really valuable role in this in their groundwater recharge assessment tool, where they look at and they have a good understanding of when would an almond grower have an interest in actually recharging, because there are times that they would and times that they wouldn't, and that goes into the analysis that we do. And I will say that generally what we have found is that there's plenty of capacity to spread this water out on the landscape and accomplish the recharge if there was the willingness of all growers to participate.
Interesting.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Well, I think we just want to say thank you, Charles. And, I think we could have a chat the rest of the day on this with you. I don't know if it's fair to ask you, Charles, but I was going to ask everyone, what does success look like? If you're going to take a measurement of success, is more enough? Or would you say there's what would success look like?
I guess this may sound like a slogan or anything, but I really do believe that success looks like, to me, anywhere where water can be recharged responsibly, it's happening. I think that as I said, the PPIC study really highlighted what the potential is, and where we're missing those opportunities. 2023 was an exciting, and I say exciting, I don't mean to be flip again about that, because there was also a lot of there was a lot of risks and threats and damage associated with 2023 and those flows. But it really highlighted the potential for what we can do and what we should be doing. And the amount of water, going by that no one could do anything with, then in situations where there was clearly enough for the watersheds for environmental purposes, that's something that really, to me, is a failure of policy. So anytime where we have the opportunity that there are no barriers and that people are incentivized to do this, that someone will see a direct benefit from utilizing their lands where it can where it makes sense to help put that water back into the aquifer. So really it's just that we're meeting our full potential. That's what success looks like, and that we have enough water for the uses that have been established, that we're not seeing massive changes in the economy, and that this honestly that that these ways of life in the valley and elsewhere are continuing as they have, with adequate water supplies.
Thank you, Charles. I like that goal. Wherever it can be done, it should be done, and is being done. Thank you. We'll move to our next panelist, our presenter, Philip. I was wondering if you were prepared to start. And Philip, I'm sorry, I'm not prepared to give your introduction. If you could share your introduction with us and then your presentation.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. I'm really honored to be here, and I'm happy to be here. I'm Phil Bichond. I have a PhD out of Berkeley, did work Duke for a while, and then came back to California, and I've been doing a variety of innovative applied water resources solutions since about 2000. And in 2010, I worked with Don Cameron to pioneer the first recharge project down Terranova. On that project, we brought in Sustainable Conservation and UC Davis into that project. And since I've been pretty heavy in it, I continue to do a lot of work down there in the Fresno area on recharge and with regard to Sigma and Floodmar non-farm recharge. And I'm also have been involved in efforts in other parts of the state. Right now, I'm pretty active in wine country. So that's my background. And let me share my screen. It is that sharing. Let's see.
There it is.
Okay, great. And I'm gonna. And is it still sharing? Yeah. Okay, so I was going to give. I have some ideas. Bryce asked for what success was in recharge, and I would define it as fast, flexible, and efficient recharge across public-private partnerships. So, efficient means, people are not wasting a lot of time, wasting unnecessary resources to get it done, that they respond when the water's there. And I think this whole Floodmar approach really is a public-private partnership. And so there's a benefit and cost of having a public-private partnership. There's equity. And so that's part of it too. So I'm going to get a little bit into the weeds. Charles gave a great presentation. I really enjoyed that. He hit a lot of points. I'm going to try to put some meat to the bones of what he talked about. And I'll try to be pretty fast. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was like the success and effectiveness of the water rights process and of the recharge process. So there was, of course, 2023 water year, and there was 4.1 million acre feet recharged, and that's reported by DWR in their May 2025 report. And of that 4.1 million, there was about 1.2 million acre feet that was under water rights, under temporary permits from the state water board for recharge. And of that 1.2 million, 40,000 acre feet was recharged. So about 3% of the permitted capacity was recharged in 2023. Now the rest of the recharge happened with floodwater, and it happened through GSAs. And the floodwater was from the executive order, which has since been codified. And the GSAs, 4.1 million, it's not really clear if that includes these others, but I assume it does because the GSAs are reporting it. And so of that 4.1 million recharged by the GSAs, the question is, how much of that had actually a water right associated with it? And how much, there's a lot of I think there's a lot of concerns in the state about cowboys, cowboys going off and doing what they do, and how much of this was by cowboys, how much was how much it had a riparian right and can't really do temporary storage, and how much of it was to meet a beneficial use when these rights were when there is no beneficial use for recharge. And so there's that issue there. So there's this issue in 2023 that only 3% of the permitted capacity of those that asked for permits was given. And then the other one is that there's an unknown amount of the GSA recharge that was not permitted, but considering the circumstances and history, probably very little of it. So then you say, well, that was, how does that stand up over time? And Yolo County Flood Control District is a good example of someone who's done it a long time. They had 8 years from 2016 to 2023 where they did 72,000 acre-foot permits, temporary permits every year for a total of 504,000 acre-feet. And over that whole period, they recharged 21,000 acre-feet. So they averaged about 5% of what they asked for and were permitted for actually was recharged. Now, 1 year the maximum was 15% 1 year. So when you think about it, it's like, these, when we talk about permitted capacity and people are saying, oh, you have a million acre-feet of permitted capacity. Well, what does that really mean? It probably means something on the order of 30, 50,000 acre-feet is actually going to be recharged. So what does that mean? And so like DWR has an annual 500,000 acre-foot permit goal, a recharge goal. And given that inefficiency in the right process, if everyone was to try to get it right, you would need 2 million to 17.5 million permitted acre-feet capacity each year to meet that goal. Now, and that percentage is whether you're assuming the Yolo County average value, the Yolo County maximum value, the 2023 value, or maybe a high target, which is randomly just estimated by me of 25%, which is no one's ever got close to. Now, there's about 3 million acre-feet of overdraft in California. And to meet that, you need between 12 million and 100 million acre-feet permitted. So what does that mean? For the 500,000 acre-feet recharge permit under the current water right process and with the history of what the typical temporary water right looks like, which is about 30,000 acre-feet, you need, for the 500,000 capacity, you need 70 to 400 permits each year approved. And I mean, Charles got into a lot more detail about other alternatives, but this is just sort of a presentation of effort, okay? And so that's like, if you consider that each permit takes about 4 months to go through the process, that's 20 to 130 process years for each year that for the temporary water right permit that were used historically since 2016. I mean, these are the ones that were designed by the board for this process for underground storage. Now, to address overdraft, you need between 400 and 3,000 permits, and that's 130 to 1,100 process years. So that's a lot of time. And then if you think, well, if a permit cost, let's say the permitted cost, and I haven't checked out what the real costs are now, and it depends on how big your project is, but let's say it's $10 an acre foot $10 per permitted acre foot. Well, when you consider the inefficiencies and the uncertainty and stuff like that, the real cost of that is somewhere between $40 to $300 per acre foot of actually diverted water for recharge. And that doesn't include cost for management, developing facilities, subsequent extraction, which at the landowner level, and this isn't at the regional level, landowner level is probably somewhere in the order of $150 to $300 based on what we've done with Don Cameron's place. So, when all things considered, you're talking somewhere between probably an estimate of $200 to $600 per acre foot, given these numbers. Now, the permit cost is wrong now, but that's just what we're facing under the current system. Now, I wanted to talk about some alternatives, and for the Russian River, we're looking at so that's that thing. I'm going to now move on to this next topic I had, which was the 90-20 rule. And that's this 90-20 rule is what is essentially what Charles talked about with regard to streamlined water availability analysis, essentially. And it's this simplify the water availability analyses for these types of permits. And if you can show that it's a 90-20 rule, or if you do the 90-20 rule, then you have sort of a fast track on your water availability analyses, which is good to have. But I've been working a lot in the Russian River, and this is looking at the Russian River, and this is a little wonky, this graph, but you know, that's how it goes, I guess. What I have on the right is I have the water years of 2013 through 2018 along the Water River. And in blue, I highlight water flows in which flows are above a 210 CFS threshold that we believe is the threshold for abundance in the Russian River. And that 210 CFS level is above the irrigation use level for the river, and then some. NOAA Fisheries and others have bought in this Sonoma water, and they feel like this protects the demand. It's an excess of the minimum flows for this river area, and it's like a jump off point to high flows, not flood flows, high flows. And so the areas in red are a period that we just defined as scarcity, and that's the period probably longer than June to September, but in this case we're showing for June to September, and that's when all your water demands are really kicking in at a big scale. Now you could say maybe it's as early as April, because your demands at that time, you know, is for beneficial uses include irrigation, frost protection, things like that, and those all become active sometime around March or April. So those two things are driving this abundance or scarcity idea. One is, you know, what are the flows in the river, and then what is the anticipation of when your rights are going to really kick in and you're going to have a lot of demand. So this is the abundance for scarcity defined area. And when you look at, you know, what it means is if we do this, if we are able to like work this through the system at the Russian River and get them to buy into this idea, which I think they will, but their threshold, they're pushing a much higher threshold at this point. You know, we would divert about over 6,000 acre feet a year on average from the Russian River. And that would be, and we would have 110 days of recharge in the Russian River for doing that. And in a dry year, we would still have on average 100 days. Now the 90-20 rule, which is what is being codified so far, it's codified in the permit water availability analysis. It's been codified in the new water code language that the board just approved regarding the permit cost. That would allow us 1,000 acre feet on average to be diverted. We'd have an average of 18 days, because it's a 90-20 rule, in case you don't know, is that when you have 90% flows, you're able to divert 20% of the river. So we'd have 18 potential days a year, and during dry years, we'd have 5 potential days, which is essentially nothing, because you have to mobilize, you have to demobilize, you have equipment and resources you have to bring to bear. So 5 days, you're never going to get recharged over that in the dry year in this scenario. And in the wet year, you're not going to hit those 18 days, because you're going to still have those periods that you have to mobilize and demobilize. So what you have in comparing these things, if people were to buy into this trigger approach, this abundance of flow trigger approach, you'd have 6 times more recharge days and 6 more times recharge potential, 20 times more days in the Russian River, and it'd be effective under wet and dry years. And under the 90-20 rule, on the other hand, you would have you get 15% of the return on your investment, you know, for all the stuff that you do for recharge. So like all the stuff that Don Cameron does at Terra Nova Ranch, or these others who are doing it, they get 15% of the return on investment in comparison to if there was a different approach. And it's essentially ineffectual under dry years. And there is some potential that is a greater environmental and hydrologic risk. The environmental data supporting the 90-20 rule is very, very questionable. when you look at those references. And when you think about it, well, when you think about like pulling 20% of the flow off a river suddenly, there's a lot of risk with that. Whereas if you were to do this other approach we're presenting in the Russian River, we're sipping off at some trigger. We start sipping off. And so when you look at the curves of the river, you don't see any effect. So that was the second thing I want to talk about. The third thing I wanted to talk about was permit construction and the ERIMS database. So, you know, when you look at the demand calculations, there's a lot of tools that have been developed for helping understand senior demand. And a lot of them are quite impressive. You know, there's some good GIS tools out there. Most of them appear to have been put together. Well, some of them are available on the state portal. I think UC Davis has played a role in developing some of them. And there's one in the Russian River called the Drought Tool. It has an acronym, but it's easier to just call it Drought Tool. Anyway, under normal conditions, when you go to the board, they want you to develop the demand, and they develop the demand based on what the permits specify as the demand. Now it's flow and volume, and in those flow estimates for the demand are based on someone, when they did the permit, deciding what their maximum flow would be for their property needed. Sometimes they don't have the infrastructure to even support that maximum flow, but they have this maximum flow. These permits are pretty old. Many are really old. And those maximum flows could be, when you think about like farming and when you would need the maximum flow, a lot of that has to do with either impact sprinklers that you're maybe putting on every 20 days or every 10 days or 14 days. You're probably rotating around your field, so you're probably not really getting to your maximum flows. The other maximum flow would be if you're doing frost protection, you really need to cover an area with water to prevent damage. So anyway, for the Russian River, we looked at what the permit has specified as flows and volumes, and what has actually been reported, and that's what this curve is. This is what's been reported in the A code is for appropriative rights, and the S code is for statements of diversion, which are riparian rights. And the lower line is permitted diversions, and the y-axis is average monthly diversions. And you can see that there's actually no relationship between the two. So all the reported diversions that are being done that are in the databases go back in the Russian River, they go back to 2007, 2008. There's no relationship for the most part. Now there is some relationship with like municipalities or more urban groups that have a constant demand. But a lot of these things, this is a comparison of month-to-month data. Now, one of the reasons there's no relationship is because the permit is an instantaneous flow specification, where the reported is a monthly calculation. But then the other reason there's no really relationship, at least in the Russian River, is because technology has changed. And they've moved to micro sprinklers and drip, and they're generally more efficient, and they spread those flows across their property more uniformly and over longer periods of time.
Phyllis, we have a question from Glenda. Glenda, do you want to have a question about this slide or something that's up?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sitting here rather befuddled because I can't think of a better example of comparing apples and oranges than to talk about the Russian River and Alexander Valley as far as groundwater storage goes. That whole basin is one gigantic sponge of gravel underneath some topsoil. To the best of my knowledge, there aren't even discrete groundwater storage basins there. So if you could maybe shed some light on, to me, this is not what we're talking about down in any part of the Central Valley whatsoever. It just feels to me like this is apples and oranges, and I'm having a hard time buying your data, quite frankly.
Well, Glenda, this is not about whether they're doing recharge at the Alexander Valley. This is about construction of the water right permit. And
But
so
the
this-
conversation
this-
today
all
is
through-
about
all through-
groundwater storage and recharge.
all through, this is about getting understanding you need to get a water right. Only way you can get a beneficial use off of recharge is to get a water right. And there's a process to get a water right. And that process is to show, it includes a water availability analysis in which you have to show the demand. And what I'm showing is the comparison of what the data is to develop that demand and what is really being taken. Now, clearly in the Central Valley, like where Dawn is, where they're doing, well, not where Dawn is, because they rely entirely on groundwater. But in some areas, they are like drawing a more consistent water source. But that doesn't change I mean, if you want to talk about apples and oranges, I'm happy to talk about that. But the apples and oranges here is that one is a monthly demand and one is an instantaneous demand. And the instantaneous demand was built at a time, in many of these cases, where the technology and approaches for irrigation were much different. And the monthly demand now is under a period of time in which we're now watering to the demand of the crop, or we're meeting some set beneficial demand. And you look at what the GSAs do, and they say, well, this is the yield that we need to have for this area. And that yield is really based on this beneficial demand. So this has nothing to do with the fact that Russian River is or is not doing recharge. This is a fact that you have a universal system throughout California. And this is an example I can present.
Philip, are we getting close to a wrap-up slide?
Yeah. So so I wanted to talk a little bit about the ERIMS database because there's a lot of errors in the ERIMS database.
We've got two more speakers, Philip, and I was just wondering if we go right ahead, but try to move us along.
Yeah. Well, all I was gonna say, there's a lot of issues in the ERIMS database. That's what I wanted to bring up. And a lot of those issues are order of magnitude issues. So there's reporting issues that are off by orders of magnitude. And there's also like there's misses in transfer of management of their units of those flows. And all those seem like pretty minor, except that so maybe it's like 1% to 2% of the data entries have issues in the reported values, but those values are off by 1 million. And so when you look at the effect of that across the whole database, that is a really significant effect because it's 1% off by 1 million. So it's a 10 to the 4th error propagating through the system. And then I'll just talk about some big picture things. You know, one of the big picture things that I've tried to talk about here is this abundance versus scarcity approach that we're using at the Russian River, but I think it would be a useful approach across the entire state. And you could have triggers on your river abundance that would be watershed based. And during those periods you have abundance, you'd have more freedom to do recharge and diversions, and you could perhaps get away from these really arduous state water permit requirements. And then during periods where it's more scarce, you could go and fall back on the system as it now stands. You know, without some serious changes to this whole approach, you know, the state's not going to will not be able to keep up with the water right need. You know, I've demonstrated that with the amount of time that it takes to do these permits, and Floodmart will greatly underperform, and you're in the end, the GSAs or GSA-like agencies are going to have to do the management of it. So,
thank you, Philip. Any questions for Philip? Is that your wrap-up slide there? The big picture?
yeah, that's fine.
Thank you. I think one of the takeaways I've got here, Philip, is just that the 90-20 rule isn't very practical. It's incredibly restrictive on being able to accomplish what we need.
That's absolutely right. And the permits are timeline. I mean, the amount of time that it takes to process them is just it's not going to be fast, flexible, or efficient. You know, it's just too much time and effort.
I was wondering if we could go to the next presentation, Philip, and then handle questions between you, Philip, and Lee, and Bill in a group setting.
Sure, I'll stop sharing this.
I think we'll probably have some overlaps in content and recommendations, and we can handle maybe questions in more of a roundtable. Next is our next speaker is Lee Bergfeld. Lee is an engineer with MBK, and I believe you're the principal or one of the principal engineers. Are you maybe even the managing partner, Lee, of MBK? But would you give us the appropriate introduction, and Lee, and then we'll get going to your presentation.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Bryce. So yeah, my name is Lee Bergfeld. I'm a principal here at MBK. We've been working on groundwater recharge in a number of different ways. And as I mentioned before, kind of linking to Charles's discussion of the watershed studies, which are being funded and done by DWR. We've been working on a lot of the technical analysis there, and we've been working with some of the local agencies going back to Yolo County's first temporary permit that they filed for recharge, and then kind of working through there. So I'm got a few slides. As Bryce said, I think some of this information you've heard before, so we'll just try to move through this at a relatively brisk pace. I'm sharing my screen. Can folks see that?
Yes.
Great. Awesome. Okay, so I look back at my files and realized that I gave a presentation about 18 months ago to this same group, and so I want to talk a little bit about that very briefly. Talk about what our experiences have been over the past 2 water years in 2023 and 2024. And by the way, happy water year 2025 as we kick off the new water year this year. And then we talk a little bit about some of those potential options. So in the previous presentation, we talked about some of the water right process and the fees. Charles did an excellent job of kind of walking through that again this morning. We've been working on a lot of this over the past 2 years under funding by the Department of Water Resources, which has really enabled us to provide technical support to local agencies who are looking to file these temporary permits and kind of help them through that process. And I just want to acknowledge that funding from DWR, I think, has been very helpful. I think it's been helpful to educate a lot of folks on the process. The key point that I mentioned in February was that this cost of obtaining this temporary water right for groundwater recharge, it really exceeds the expected recharge that you're going to get, or the value out of that expected recharge. And I think, Philip was, hitting on some of those exact same points in his presentation. So let's talk a little bit about what our experiences have been. So in 2023, we ended up filing 2 temporary applications and received 2 temporary permits from the board. Both of those permits included the version criteria, which are this 90-20 criteria or approach that you've heard a fair amount about. They also included flood thresholds for flows. So independent of whether the flow was above the 90th percentile on a given day, we established some flood thresholds of when the flow is at this level, it creates flooding under which we could divert. Spent a lot of time coordinating with both the state board and with CDFW on this, because we've been talking a bit about the water rights, but I'll say there are also permits that can include a lake and streambed alteration agreement and screening criteria for temporary pumps and diversions, which require coordination with CDFW. And this bottom, or the table, then just kind of illustrates the summary of this. And this is, I think, again, pointing to some of the things that Philip was mentioning. There was a permitted capacity in those 2 rights of around 21,000 acre feet, and Stockton East was able to divert 119. So that's not a very high percentage. As Philip talked about Yolo County, you have to keep in mind that Yolo County has actually been, in my mind, one of the more successful rechargers over the past few years. I want to be completely transparent. The 90-20 criteria were one reason why that difference in diverted volume is so much less than the maximum that was permitted, but it's not the only criteria. There were a number of challenges as we work through some of these things. Screening criteria, being able to be responsive and flexible and getting up to speed and being able to turn on and turn off were some of the other limitations. So that was 2023. We learned a bit from that experience and educated some folks along the way. And then we came into 2024. So in 2024, we helped help provide technical support or file 6 temporary applications. Those are listed here. And we had a mix of 90-20 criteria for the first 2, and then the next 3 looked at site-specific diversion criteria that were requested. And in part, these were requested because of our experience in 2023 and the limitations that we felt we had identified with the 90-20 approach. So we worked on some different alternative diversion criteria, and unfortunately, we weren't successful in that. And the board opted to issue all of the permits with 90-20 criteria. You'll see that one for Colusa groundwater is NA because Colusa essentially said don't issue the permit with the 90-20 criteria as we kind of expected. So those 3 with the asterisks, we requested something different than what we received. And you can see again, only Stockton East was able to divert any water in 2024. And it's in part because of Stockton East, just their setup there, it allows them to be very flexible and responsive. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these challenges that we see with the 90-20 criteria, and then get to a couple of potential options or solutions. So as I think Philip and maybe some others have mentioned, right, there's these limited, very short durations of when water is available. And that's what this figure on the slide is trying to illustrate. So we've got water year 2024, or excuse me, the December through March 2024 period, right? This is the primary 4-month season for some of these streamlined criteria that Charles mentioned that the board has. So it's this 4-month period, and we've got 2 lines. One, this black dash line is that 90th percentile flow, right? So we go back to the data, we calculate what this looks like, and that's what it looks like on a daily basis. So this is what the flow has to exceed in order to be able to turn on and take a diversion under a permit that has these diversion criteria. So the blue line is the actual flow in Bear Creek, and this is this is a small creek down near Merced Irrigation District and coming off of the foothills between the Merced and the Chowchilla rivers, if you're familiar with the area. So it's a small stream fed by a rain-fed watershed up above it. So you can see that blue line is what the actual flow was in Bear Creek, and you can see that it did periodically jump above that 90th percentile, which would allow for diversions. But as has been discussed, that would mean that you've got to be ready to go. It's very difficult to forecast or predict when this might occur. So you need to be ready to go and responsive. Really, you would need your temporary pumps to be ready throughout the winter period, and so that you're really only throwing on a switch. And I mentioned Stockton East, and that's essentially what they can do. Their facility is an existing diversion facility just downstream of a small flood control dam, and they're able to operate it with a SCADA system and kind of look at it from their desk and say, yep, flows are above the 90th, and we can open up the canal and turn it on. Nope, they drop below, turn it off. And with that ability to really turn off and on from your desk, they're able to take advantage of some of this. I don't think you really can if you're in a situation where you've got to deploy equipment and things. The other key part of this is that these, we go above this typically following precipitation and a fair amount of precipitation. And I think that's pretty common throughout the state. That means that your recharge areas are likely saturated, And if you were trying to deploy a temporary pump, right, a lot of folks would be like, yeah, I'm not wanting to drive across my field right now, right, and take equipment out there to do that. So those are just a couple of challenges. I want to move quickly to some potential options. And so as we've been working through this and thinking about it, the first one I know doesn't work everywhere in the state. I understand that, but it is an option for some folks. And that's the use of the water rights for the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project that are held by Reclamation and DWR. They both have programs within those water rights that allow for the diversion of excess flows, essentially, whether that's Section 215 or Article 3F from the Central Valley Project or Article 21 supply off the State Water Project. Those are out there. If you can take advantage of them, I think that's that would be my recommendation is your best bet to do so. The next one is I think worth thinking about, which are some temporary changes to existing water rights. Now, if you have a water right and anybody talks to you about making a change to it, it should probably make you a little bit nervous, right? Because if you've got a right, you know that you don't really want to open that can of worms up. And I'm not advising that you should, but I think that it's maybe possible to limit that risk by doing some temporary changes, specifically for some pilot projects or some small changes, just not unlike what you have right now. It may allow you to take advantage of some of that permit capacity, which Philip was just talking about, that may be within your right, but you're not currently utilizing. So it's an option, a possibility. This last part is something we've been thinking about a little bit, is this 5-year cumulative volume. So we've worked a lot, and everything that I've talked about so far has been for your temporary 180-day permits. The board also has temporary 5-year permits, but I understand that's a lot more labor intensive and requires more coordination. But I think there might be a possibility where you would apply for a 5-year permit, but it's limited by a cumulative volume, so that maybe it doesn't require quite as much review and administrative time on the board's point, so that if you get that full volume in the first year, then your permit was done and you would have to go back to the board. But if your first year is a dry year, and you don't get any diversion or recharge opportunity, then you don't need to do anything to go back to the board, and maybe then you get a little bit the next few years, but you're still capped by this total volume. And I would hope that may take a little bit less work on the board's part to permit that. So I'm going to pause there in the interest of time, and then however we'd like to go, proceed.
Thank you very much, Lee. A great presentation. Thank you for those examples and for building on Philip's presentation. I'd like to move to Bill. And Bill, if we would maybe cover your presentation in around 10 minutes, then we'll have time for Q&A.
Be quicker than 10 minutes because I don't have a presentation, but what I can do is maybe share a few tidbits and maybe a little bit of the human side of the story to the presentation that Lee did.
And Bill, would you, I should introduce you, the general manager of the Tamacalusa Canal Authority. That's a recent position change from being at the Dunnigan Irrigation and at RD 108. But would you give us that introduction and then go ahead?
Certainly. Yeah, so my name is Bill Vanderwall. I am now the general manager at the Tamacalusa Canal Authority. For those not familiar with the Tamacalusa Canal, it essentially moves water from its pumping plant in Fish Green and Red Bluff along the west side of the Sacramento Valley. So think of west of I-5 for the most part, all the way down to Dunnigan, where the I-5 and 505 interchange are at. Prior to coming here in June, I was the deputy manager at Reclamation District 108, which is a Sacramento River settlement contractor. And also, as part of that role, general manager for Dunnigan Water District, which is a service contractor off of the Coosa Canal surrounding Dunnigan. While we were at Dunnigan, you saw in Lee's presentation that we had been one of the permit applications. We'd received a temporary 180-day permit. When we were analyzing whether to pursue that permit or not, we looked at, well, we have Section 215 water from the Bureau of Reclamation. How much water could we, when was the availability? We did an availability analysis with MBK on that 215 water, compared it to the 90/20 analysis that the state board does, and then also compared it to what we called an alternative analysis, which essentially mimicked the conditions that Sites Reservoir is pursuing. When we did the application, we put forth the alternative analysis as the proposal. Obviously, heard from Lee that the state board defaulted to their 90/20 analysis. The result of that was, once we were issued the permit, there was literally in February a 24-hour period where we could have conceivably diverted. It was like half of one day and half the morning of the other day. So it wasn't feasible. I mean, it wasn't realistic to even be able to divert. We were looking for 5,000 acre feet total for the year, with a maximum diversion capacity that I believe was 80 CFS off of the Sacramento River. It was, I think the human part that I want to share is, as the deputy manager at RD 108, we have our guys out there doing levee patrol for potential flooding issues. And we couldn't divert to do recharge in Dunnigan. And that just is like, how do you explain that to the farmers that are interested in seeing this groundwater recharge happen? And some of them have contributed funds to help pay for purchase of or payment of the water moving it in the diversion. So I think, that was pretty, damning testament that we've already covered, today. And so I want to kind of pivot right now to looking forward. What are we looking forward to here in the Sacramento Valley on the west side and the east side? Many of you are probably familiar with the long-term operations agreement that's being developed between the settlement contractors and the Bureau of Reclamation, and DWR, I think, is involved in that as well. And that's looking at a potential years where you may potentially short the settlement contractors a further 25%. And my districts over here on the TC are junior water right holders. And so we're looking at, well, what are we going to do for water? We have permanent crops. You can't just idle that, as you're all well aware. So we're beginning to investigate, groundwater recharge and recovery of that water. What does that look like? We have a couple of GSAs here in Glenn County and Coosa County that they're right now, I feel like they're struggling. They didn't get funding for projects when DWR did the grants, and they're kind of struggling for, where did they move forward and establish even just the fees for themselves to operate right now. So it's a very dynamic situation here in the west side of the Sacramento Valley, with some significant challenges, but I feel like we've got some good leadership groups that are starting to develop between Reclamation District 108, Dunnigan Water District, Coosa County Water District. They're looking at projects that they're going to fund or work on funding. And up in Orland Artois Water District, which is in the Orland Artois area, the northern part of Glenn County, along with Glen Coosa Irrigation District. And so that's kind of what we're looking forward to for recharge looking into the future. You know, how can we maximize the water in these years when we actually have it, like this year? Well, as of yesterday this year, right? The 2024 year water year was ended, but how do we maximize when we do have those 100% allocations, and get the water into the ground and get the aquifer sustainable just on a general basis? So I'd be happy to take questions about any specifics, you know, pertaining to Dunnigan recharge that I can speak to, or what we're looking at moving forward.
Thank you, Bill. I think we have an opportunity to now for there to be a conversation between the board members and the presenters. But could I just though ask you a clarifying question, Bill? Your comment was you had at RD 108 you had team members out looking at the levees because the water was so high.
Yes, we were
Yeah.
concerned about flooding.
You were worried about flooding, but the conditions weren't right.
Conditions
for-
to divert for recharge
Wow.
under that permit.
Wow, that is you just think that's just not reality. But questions from the panel or the board to the panelists, or panelists to panelists? I just have this be an open discussion. And if I could ask the panelists or the presenters, like I did Charles, what does success look like, or what would be your recommendations for the board, for our committee to recommend to the board for action items?
You know, Bryce, sorry, I'll just jump in here. From the Tama-Coosa Canal Authority perspective, I think success is, one, we have to have a sustainable aquifer, and two, we have to be able to get water to our landowners, so that in these drought years they can still at least keep their investments safe, their permanent crops safe. Or, you know, if there's just an absolute shortage of resources, as in water, you know, then it would require a transition to, you know, fewer permanent crops. But that's something that we would like to see at the TCCA is just being able to, you know, get them water in years where they're not being devastated by loss of their investments in the crops that they do have.
Thank you, Bill. Philip?
Well, I was just wanted to comment to Bill that the condition that he talked about with regard to like a lot of water flowing by and not being able to recharge it because you don't have the right, is exactly what's happened at the McMullen projects, where we've seen just, you know, a lot of water go by Terra Nova Ranch, and not going to take it into the McMullen project.
We've experienced the same thing. Mike Gallo.
Yeah, I'd like to say that in the case of our GSA, we were working with Merced Irrigation District on the permitting process. And between the two GSAs, invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into the permitting process. And in Merced County, we actually had flooding and still couldn't take the water.
Wow. And what was the impediment? Was it the 90-20 or
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
You know, now on the other hand, you know, the governor's executive order allowed us to take some water for a period of time. And so we were able to do some groundwater recharge. And so, you know, to me, it's fixable. I mean, we were able to take the water through the governor's executive order. It's just a matter of changing the rules so we can take some water.
Is the governor's executive order perpetual, or is it does it have to be renewed every year?
Not, my understanding is that it's not.
Okay.
not.
Philip,
Yeah, I think one of the issues with with Floodmar program is the word flood. And I think that like sets it up to be like, and that's like the basis of where you go with the 90-20 rule, and the genesis of that is this idea that you can only recharge when flood. And that's really a high bar. And when you consider like the environment where these rivers are, a lot of hardening, a lot of things have gone on, changes in their construction and stuff like that, you know, those flood waters may not really be that great for them. You know, they may not really have the capacity for that. And then you have all this risk of areas adjacent that are going to be flooded. And so it seems to me that what we should be thinking about, I mean, what I would propose is, and I talked about this in my talk, is an abundance and scarcity period. Scarcity is what California's water rights are really about. And scarcity is like, well, you know, you don't take the water when someone else might need it, but there's periods of abundance that you could really define by watershed pretty easily, and by riverway. And you could say, you know, if you're above these thresholds of abundance, then you have a right to that water. And you could have a very streamlined permitting process where you say, this is the demand that might be there, you know, and use proxies for those demands, and then really rely on these triggers to when you could take water for a benefit. And then once that period's gone, then you just go back to the water rights system as it is. I mean, it's pretty simple. When you're sitting at Terra Nova Ranch or what Bill's talking about, and you're watching all this water go by, and you know where it's going, and it's straight to the Pacific, you know, it's very frustrating. And like Lee talked about, and Bill talked about, there's a lot of money spent on getting these water right permits, and it's just wasted effort.
that 2024 list you had there, Lee, you had almost 40,000 in those 6 districts, and that the diversion was actually 42 acre feet, or was that 42,000 acre feet?
Oh, it was 42, right?
42, that's it. That's something, but it's almost nothing out of wow. Hey, so when I hear Philip talk about abundance and scarcity, do we just have the wrong numbers? Should it be more like 50-20? Mike.
The other problem we ran into was that the CDFW required fish screens on pumps. So these are temporary pumps that are put in when there's high water. The diverters on the rivers don't have to have fish screens for irrigation purposes, but for this purpose, they required fish screens.
Wow, which makes it challenging. Lee.
Yeah, just to echo what Mike said there, right? In even existing diversion facilities, if you wanted to use them for recharge, right, you might use them in the summer for irrigation, and they are not screened because they've essentially been grandfathered in. And so, but if you wanted to use them in the winter for a recharge diversion, the requirement was that they needed to be screened. So that's a big financial issue. Bryce, getting back to your question, do we have the wrong numbers, right? First, we've done some analysis. We've looked at this again, funding from DWR. What happens if we used 70% and 15, 70-15 and 80-10 and a variety of different things. We looked at what happens if we did this on an average weekly or an average monthly basis, as you saw, right, that 90th percentile on a daily, goes up and down a lot. It can be 1,000 one day and 500 the next. So you really just, if your storm falls on the next, you're in good shape. If your storm falls on today, not so much. It works. It starts to chip at the margins, I would say, but it doesn't make a really significant dent on this. We've had a lot of conversations with the board, and I want to be fair to them. I think I liked how Charles kind of phrased this in his opening comments. It's not easy. These are not easy questions that we are dealing with and that the board is dealing with, and they take their role in protecting public trust resources very seriously. I'm an engineer, so I'm not going to pretend to know what the right answer is as it relates to fisheries and biology. I know there's been a lot of points raised here, but that's the issue that we are really grappling with. It's a finite resource and differing opinions about what the best use of that resource is. And I think Charles mentioned where's the area that we can do best in terms of research. It gets to that. It gets to the issue on what is the flow that's needed and required. I think that's exactly right. Unfortunately, it's been our experience where we've kind of worked on some things where we felt like we had a pretty good basis for what we were proposing as the diversion criteria that had supporting evidence, because all of these things are site specific, right? You can't say that what's good on one river is good on another river in a different watershed 100 miles away. Maybe it's coastal versus Central Valley, et cetera. It's site specific, but unfortunately where we did go down that path, I think the board as a regulator honestly was just risk adverse, right? They were really afraid of taking that risk, which I think we should be able to do for a temporary permit for a pilot project. I think some of those things are really key in just moving the board, because again, that's a difficult choice. It's a difficult decision that they have to make. But if we could get them to be slightly less risk adverse on some of these temporary things, because we can't build these projects at scale until we demonstrate they work for pilots and for small projects. And that's where we need some flexibility.
Yep, less risk averse on these temporary pilot projects. Don Cameron.
Yeah, Bryce, this conversation is really pertinent, and we tend to get excited when the snowpack is big and we move forward, but we forget so quickly when we get into dry conditions. It's off the table. I'd just like to say that when we look at the 180-day permits, to me those you have to apply in the summer. You have absolutely no idea what kind of a water year you've got coming down. You spend a lot of money on these, and even more now with the increase in fees. I don't feel the 180 days are really effective. And the state board has recommended 5-year permits, and I agree completely. But I still think that if we're only getting 3 to 5% of the permitted water in the ground, we've got a real problem that we really need to fix. Sometimes some of these permits for taking water have a time period on that don't correspond to snow melt, which can be a real factor on some of the rivers throughout California. They're not all rain fed. You've got snow melt that comes quick, you get flood release. And many times that's outside of the permitted period. And we tend to forget that we do get flood protection out of the projects, these recharge projects, that do prevent damage downstream. And you mentioned the fish screens. I know I heard a comment on one in the Chowchilla region where the water comes once every 4 years, and they're required to put fish screens on their pumps. So I think there's a lot of things we can do. I think we can put together a very effective letter outlining some of the issues, and hopefully some really good solutions from our water committee here. So thanks, Bryce. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dawn. Charles and Philip, and then I think we will want to kind of look at closing things up here. Charles, did you pull your hand down, or you want to go ahead?
I just pulled my hand down so I don't forget to unlower it. But and I'll be very quick because I know
Right.
we're at time. I just wanted to reinforce. I mean, I think the information that Philip and Lee presented, plus the experiences that Bill has related here. I mean, those numbers, that is an unmitigated, that is an absolute policy failure. I think those presentations and these kind of testimonies really tell that story well. You just show someone these numbers, and clearly things are not working as they need to be working. And you asked, what can this board do? At the moment, I mean, the regulatory processes that we're talking about are mostly under the direct control of the water board, of course. So it starts there. I'm glad CDFW came up with the fish screens. That was an issue we encountered during the original executive order. And it's something we try to continue to kind of fight off as because it was codified, of course, in SB 122. And there's been conversations around that, so we're trying to get all the agencies to work together. I think at this stage, the various members of this board, that's the most important thing, is just to relay this information and these experiences and amplify that information. I know you all, you work closely with other agency counterparts, with folks in the regulated community, with folks in different advocacy spaces. I think just giving more airtime to these documented experiences is going to help affect some change, because that is not 42 acre feet out of all those permits. That's insane. And I think that is pretty clear to anyone that's looking at it.
Thanks for that, Charles, and thanks for the idea that we can relay this and give it airtime. Philip and Glenda.
Here, I'll just say that Bryce, you asked about the threshold, and I think that is really, I think it's probably a water, like Lee has talked about, it's a watershed by watershed, river by river determination. But one can make a determination, without really going into a lot of hardcore research, by looking at like what are the flows over the last 10 or 15 years, and then you could have some process where you have that moving trigger as you get more data. And maybe that data that trigger is initially set up on what you think you need for ecological flows. What are the demands that are during the year and the dry years? I think you could come up with not a number, but a method. And that method could then be applied to where you want to do it. I guess the other thing is just back to Don's point, when, with the efficiencies we're talking about on these permits, what would people in the state say if you told them that our surface water reservoirs are operating at 5 to 10% capacity because of all the regulations? I mean, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about, a serious source of water for this state. And people would be, maybe a risk averse, but there's a real risk of not having enough water too. So, I mean, I think that's the bottom line. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Glenda.
Yeah, this has been a really great discussion. A lot of good ideas of what we need to put forth as some recommendations, perhaps. And in some ways, the one that wasn't mentioned was just not, this desire for one size fits all in almost all situations doesn't work. And this is a great example of that. So I think we really need to emphasize that. I guess my last question, Bryce, is next steps. Are we going to put together a letter with some formal comments, or what are our next steps here?
I'd like to do that, Glenda. It would be I think a recommendation from our committee to the board. Mm-hmm. And I would suggest that I see Josh's hand up, that Josh could develop some maybe next step letter recommendations. But go ahead, Josh.
So Bryce, from a staff perspective, I think it might be good for the committee to consider maybe having a discussion with representatives from the board
And DWR.
And then having the kind of that formal letter kind of follow, to kind of get kind of see the perspective and see kind of the larger kind of issues that we have.
Good. I like that idea.
I like
Josh?
that too, but I think maybe we need to have a list of what we want to explore with them as far as potential solutions.
Yes, I would concur with that, Glenda. I was gonna say, we should at least know the questions. We want to make sure we're asking the right questions that are based on the information we have in hand. Thank you.
So, could we as committee members, board members, write some of those questions down and send them by email, maybe copy each other, but send them to, we can't copy each other, send them to Josh.
Just send them to me,
individually.
thank you, do not copy each other.
Okay, and that we would generate a list of questions that the committee could look through, and that maybe we would have another meeting then, or try to schedule a meeting in a month with DWR and representative of DWR and State Water Resource Control Board.
Yeah, we could definitely do that. We just have to look at dates, but yes, that's possible. And then also, as the secretary suggested, love to hear from questions from the speakers as well. Your presentations have been extremely valuable to our discussion today, and so your thoughts would be very helpful.
So actions would be then for the committee members and panelists to send their topics and questions that we would want to meet with DWR and representative from DWR and State Water Board as the next step. Glenda, does that sound Dawn?
I think that totally makes sense. And once we do that and we have some more, some better developed ideas and we go to the full board, we probably need to figure out how to present it to the full board with a little bit of its background so that a very truncated version of what we heard today so that they could come up to speed with us.
Yep, great idea. Dawn?
Yep, yeah, maybe we can put together maybe an executive summary of the discussion we had today and list the proposals. But no, I'm all in favor of having another meeting with the DWR and the Water Board. I think that'll be really helpful. So
Mike?
sounds good. Sounds good.
Mike, you're on, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, I think Don suggested, yeah, we should move forward that way.
David?
Yeah, I think this is a great idea. Full support.
Very good. Hey, at this time, we need to open it up for public comment. Josh, would you do that?
Yes, thank you, sir. If you would like to make a public comment, please use your hand icon and I can unmute your line. I'm seeing no public comment at this time.
Thank you, Josh. Charles and Philip, Lee and Bill, would you be willing to also give your recommendations, suggestions to Josh for us to compile? Very good. Thank you, everyone. We're past by 10 minutes. It's been a really robust, informative, wonderfully engaging meeting today. And thank you for bringing your great material, your ideas, and engaging today. Happy October. Let's all enjoy October together. We might call it something like Oktoberfest. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Josh. Thank you so much, Josh, for setting everything up.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Bryce.
Thanks, everyone.